Good morning, folks. As per our usual post-session recording, we have this introduction being post-recorded and appended to the live recorded link meeting. I would like to extend my sincere apology to everyone that this video has been delayed due to holiday season and tons of unfinished work. Therefore, one of the goals in year 2015 is to ensure that the time taken to process all the wonderful speaking session by the various renowned speakers and experts for PoSHBreakfast and PowerBreakfast will be processed in a more structured and timely manner. At this point of time, when this introduction video was recorded, we are celebrating the Lunar Chinese New Year in Singapore, and for the New Year is the Year of Good. Today we are glad to have Trevor Sullivan, Microsoft MVP for PowerShell, to share with us on automation of Azure platform with PowerShell. Welcome and thank you to Trevor for forking out the time.
Great. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending the Power Breakfast in Singapore. Thank you to Milton Go and also to Matthew Hitchcock for hosting me. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you guys. My name is Trevor Sullivan. You can find me on Twitter at PCGeek86. If you don't currently have Twitter, I would highly recommend that you join it. There's a great community of PowerShell MVPs and Azure MVPs and lots of other industry experts that you can connect with on Twitter and really learn a lot about different Microsoft enterprise solutions as you work with them. So as Milton mentioned, I am a Microsoft MVP for Windows PowerShell. I was first awarded in 2014. And God willing, I will be renewed in April of 2015. So we'll see about that. I am currently the Director of Training and Product Development with Opsgility. Just to take a moment to talk about Opsgility. Opsgility is a company that was started by Michael Washam, who is a former program manager at Microsoft. Michael Washam was working with Microsoft for about 15 years before he started Opsgility. And the goal of Opsgility is to deliver high-quality training content around Microsoft Enterprise Solutions with a focus on the Azure platform. So I've got about more than 10 years, close to 11 years now of experience on the Microsoft Windows platform. I've been working with PowerShell since about 2007, just about a year after it came out. I'm a big community member in different communities, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And I'm also a contributor to a couple of different open source projects. One of those projects is called Power Events, which is a PowerShell module that helps to work with WMI permanent event subscriptions in the Windows operating system. If you're interested in more information about that particular project, you can go to powerevents.codeplex.com. So just some different social media channels that you can connect with me and many other people on are the Microsoft MSDN and TechNet forums, the Stack Exchange network, which includes websites like superuser.com and stackoverflow.com, which are excellent websites to get questions around enterprise solutions, whether they're developer-related questions or IT pro-related questions. The Stack Exchange network provides an excellent Q&A website system that allows you to post your own questions and respond to other people's questions and vote on what you think the best quality questions and answers are. So that's a really great resource, especially for anything PowerShell and Azure related. I post videos on YouTube on a semi-regular basis. I post videos on PowerShell concepts, such as some of the new PowerShell 5.0 concepts around debugging remote run spaces or debugging background PowerShell jobs and the like. The myitforum.com website is an excellent community that is really positioned around the System Center platform. Most of the members of the MyIT Forum community are centered around the Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager tool, or SCCM. And there's a bunch of different email lists that you can subscribe to that, and there's a lot of great community members who are ready and willing to help you out. So I would definitely recommend that resource as well. On Twitter, if you're new to Twitter, there are some hashtags, or basically topics that you can subscribe to, such as PowerShell or PSDSC. And you can basically search for these topics and find related information or tweets from users that discuss these particular topics. So there's a lot of information out on Twitter, and the key to actually harvesting information from Twitter and making it useful to yourself is to really use these hashtags to subscribe to topics that are important to you. GitHub and Codeplex are a couple of open source community websites where you can publish source code and documentation for your open source projects and host discussion forums around your open source projects as well. In particular note of interest, the GitHub website is actually where Microsoft is hosting a lot more of their open source projects. One of those projects that we're going to be talking about today is the Azure PowerShell module that allows you to automate functions within the Microsoft Azure public cloud. So the Azure PowerShell module is actually hosted as an open source project on GitHub. You can download the source code and read through it. You can also subscribe as a contributor to the project if you've signed a contributor license agreement or CLA with Microsoft. But as long as you have one of those CLAs in place, you can actually contribute code back to the GitHub project for Azure PowerShell. Finally, you can connect with me on trevorsullivan.net. That is my blog where I've been blogging for about the past, I guess, 6 years now, since about May of 2009. And so yeah, there's a lot of great community resources out there. If you're not already engaged in the communities, I would highly encourage you to get involved. But I think that the Power Breakfast team is definitely a great start to getting involved in the community. So please spread the word about some of these different social media channels. So the goal for today, we're going to spend about 30 to 45 minutes talking about how to automate the Azure platform and how you can really benefit from it. So we're basically going to talk about some of the different core Azure infrastructure components, and then we're going to discuss the Azure PowerShell automation module and how you can use the different commands in that module to provision and manage resources in the Azure public cloud. We're going to be approaching the Azure topic from an IT pro perspective more than a developer perspective. The Azure platform is kind of divided up into infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, and even some software as a service topics as well. So we're really going to focus on infrastructure as a service and how you as an IT pro can use Azure PowerShell module to create those resources in Azure directly. If you guys have any questions, feel free to stop me during the presentation. I will try to keep an eye out for questions. I probably will not see in the chat window right away. So if you would like to get in touch, just go ahead and unmute your microphone and feel free to interrupt me, and I will try to get your questions answered. Milton, if you want to maybe watch the chat window and just interrupt me, that would be great.
I'm looking at it.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem.
So let's dive into the topic of automating the Azure platform. So first, before we get started, let's talk about what exactly we are automating. So for those of you who are new to the Microsoft Azure public cloud, again, the Azure public cloud offers a variety of infrastructure as a service solutions as well as platform as a service solutions. So the infrastructure as a service solutions, or IaaS, are really more IT pro geared. So this includes topics like virtual networks and Azure Active Directory for identity, Microsoft Cloud Services, Azure Traffic Manager, which is a DNS-based load balancing system, Azure Blob Storage, which allows you to host virtual machine disks or VHD files, as well as arbitrary files. And there's also Azure Virtual Machines. So Azure Virtual Networks and Azure Virtual Machines, combined with some of these other topics, really make up the heart of what an IT pro cares about from an Azure perspective. So it's very easy for us to spin up virtual networks and virtual machines in the Azure public cloud, and the benefit there is that we have elasticity in our billing, so we can start up and shut down virtual machines, and we only pay for what we actually utilize, right? So you can actually sign up for Microsoft Azure, you can register for a subscription, and if you don't provision any resources in Azure, you actually will not pay a single penny. So that's a really huge benefit of the Azure public cloud, is that you don't pay any penalty costs, you only pay for what services that you actually consume, right? So from a software developer perspective, for those who are actually writing custom applications, there's also the platform as a service role, which we're not really going to focus on today. However, a lot of the core Azure services really are geared towards developers. Things like message queuing services or Azure websites, which allows you to simply host your application code directly in an IIS instance, where you don't have to actually manage the underlying virtual machine that hosts that website. There's things like Azure SQL Database, which we will talk about a little bit, that actually allows you to host a SQL Server database directly in the cloud without actually having to manage the virtual machine and patch it and so on. So let's start by talking about a few different cloud PowerShell modules that are available. The first module that's available that you may want to familiarize yourself with is called the MS Online module. Now, what this module allows you to do is to manage the Microsoft Azure Active Directory identity platform. So for example, you can create users, you can create groups, and you can create the equivalent of organizational units in Azure Active Directory. Now, we're not really going to focus on the MS Online module that much. What we're really going to spend our time on today is talking about the Azure PowerShell module. Now, the Azure PowerShell module is divided into a couple of different modules. There's the core Azure PowerShell module, which talks to what's known as the Service Management API in Azure. And that is the traditional API that allows you to provision different resources in the Azure platform. Now, Microsoft is currently in the process of migrating to a new API for Azure called Resource Manager. So when you actually download and install the Azure PowerShell module, you not only get the Azure Service Management API module, you also get a preview version of this new Resource Manager module. Now, each of these modules accomplishes similar tasks. However, the method that the modules use to provision resources is actually quite different. So the new Resource Manager PowerShell module actually uses more of a declarative syntax, very similar to PowerShell desired state configuration. This declarative syntax allows you to declare resources such as virtual networks or virtual machines or VHD files up in Azure. And the Azure platform will actually process those declarative statements and basically make it so, as you've heard with PowerShell DSC. Now, we're really going to spend our time talking about the traditional Service Management API or the core Azure PowerShell module. So we're not really going to focus as much on Resource Manager. That's a preview module. Microsoft is still working diligently to get that into a release quality. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about the Azure PowerShell module. So let's dive into talking about Azure PowerShell. If you are new to the Microsoft Azure public cloud and you're still accustomed to provisioning resources on-premise using Hyper-V or VMware ESX or similar tools, then the first step you're going to need to do to get started with Azure is to sign up for the Azure platform. So you can either sign up for Azure using an enterprise agreement if you can sign up for an EA with Microsoft. Now, there is a certain commitment, a financial commitment you have to make to Microsoft in order to get an EA, which hovers in the range of $25,000 to $30,000 annually. Now, if you don't have that commitment, you can also sign up for what's called a pay-as-you-go subscription, where basically you provide a credit card to Azure, and you will be billed to your credit card for the resources that you consume. If you don't consume any resources in Azure, your credit card will not be billed, and you won't have to pay anything each month. Now, a third option is that if you have a Microsoft MSDN subscription, you actually get credits for the Microsoft Azure platform as part of your MSDN subscription. So depending on the level of the MSDN subscription that you have, you get a different amount of credits. You can get anywhere from $50 to $100 or $150 of credits every month if you have an MSDN subscription. So for example, PowerShell MVPs, or actually all MVPs, get a MSDN Ultimate subscription, and the MSDN Ultimate subscription offers $150 of credit. I believe the MSDN Premium subscription offers $100 of credit monthly, and then the basic MSDN subscription offers $50 per month. So if you already have an MSDN subscription or someone at your organization has an MSDN subscription but isn't utilizing the Azure credits, you might want to ping that person and see if you can get access to their Azure subscription so that you can start playing around with it. So regardless of which option you choose, the first step is to actually register for an Azure subscription. And once you have that subscription, you can begin to provision resources inside of it. Once you're signed up for the Azure platform, the next step to automating the Azure platform is to download and install the Azure PowerShell module. Now, I'm going to jump over to my web browser here, and if you go out to github.com/Azure, you'll actually see a list of the Azure open source projects that are available on GitHub. Now, you might notice that there is an Azure-PowerShell project within the Azure organization. And so if you click on the Azure PowerShell module, you can actually see all of the source code that makes up the Azure PowerShell module. In fact, you can see that 7 hours ago, the Azure PowerShell module was actually updated. So what that means is that the Microsoft team that's working on the Azure PowerShell module is actually actively developing code against this Git source control repository. So you can actually see what's happening in real time. Now, if you just simply want to download and install the module, what you want to do is go over to the Releases tab here. And you can actually see a history of all the different Azure PowerShell module releases that are available. Now, you're only going to see 2 different releases here because the Azure PowerShell module used to go by a different name. It used to go by the name Azure-SDK-Tools. So if we go out to that project page, you'll see that they put a README note in there to point you to the new repository. And if you look at the releases here, there's actually 39 historical releases of the original Azure PowerShell module. So back around the November timeframe, Microsoft changed over to the new repository name. But if you scroll through here, you can actually see a history of all the different Azure PowerShell modules that were released. And Microsoft does a very good job of taking release notes so that you can see what Azure PowerShell commands have been added or changed or removed from each version. So the first step you're going to do is go out to the Azure-PowerShell project on GitHub. Again, let me just expand that URL here so you all can see it. It's github.com/Azure/Azure-PowerShell. And then when you go into releases, you'll see the latest release. Now, there's 2 different types of installation available for the Azure PowerShell module. There's the Windows standalone installer, which if you look at the URL at the bottom of the browser there, is simply an MSI file or a Windows installer package. Now, the MSI package or Windows installer package is great if you want to deploy the Azure PowerShell module using a software distribution mechanism such as System Center Configuration Manager or Microsoft Intune or some other software distribution tool. If you are less interested in distributing it and you simply want to get it installed, the other option is to use the Web Platform Installer or WebPI tool from Microsoft. The Web Platform Installer tool is basically a graphical user interface that allows software developers to install different dependencies, such as the Azure SDK itself and other tools that they need in order to develop software against different Microsoft platforms. So you can optionally download the Web Platform Installer and install the latest version of the Azure PowerShell module through there. My personal preference every time that I update is to download the MSI package and install that locally on my laptop or in an Azure VM, because that gives me a greater level of control over what version is currently installed. So my personal preference is the MSI package. So once you've installed the Azure PowerShell module, the next thing that you need to do is basically connect the Azure PowerShell module or authenticate the Azure PowerShell module against your subscription that you signed up for in Azure. Now, when you authenticate against the Microsoft Azure platform, there's a couple of different options that you have. The traditional method of authenticating to the Azure platform uses what's called a management certificate. And there's directions available on the MSDN website about how to generate a self-signed management certificate that you basically upload to the Azure Management Portal through the GUI. And that allows you to basically create API requests using a certificate. Now, the newer direction that Microsoft is going in terms of authenticating to Azure is to use what's called Azure Active Directory Authentication. Now, you can authenticate to Azure Active Directory using either interactive or non-interactive authentication. And the choice that you have there depends on whether you want to create a PS credential yourself, or if you want to use interactive authentication, you can simply call the Add Azure Account command to authenticate against the Azure platform. So let's go ahead and take a look at how to do that really quickly. So first, I'm going to open up my Windows PowerShell session, and I've already installed the Azure PowerShell module from the MSI package. So if I were to run the get module-list available command, I should see the Azure PowerShell module listed in the results of installed modules. So if I kind of scroll through my results here, and I should finally see down here at the bottom, sure enough, the Azure PowerShell module is installed to the program files directory, and I can see what version I have installed. An important thing to note around the Azure PowerShell version is that Microsoft is actually releasing the Azure PowerShell module every several weeks, about 3 to 4 weeks or so. So if you are automating the Azure platform, you will want to make sure that you set a calendar reminder every 3 to 4 weeks to go back to the Azure GitHub project page and check to see if there is a new release available. So as you can see, the latest release was released 15 days ago. So my guess would be that in the next 7 or 8 days or so, Microsoft will probably come out with a new version of the PowerShell module. But that's simply speculation on my part. So now that I know that the Azure PowerShell module is installed, if you're running an older version of PowerShell, or if you've disabled the PowerShell module auto-loading preference, you can call the import module name Azure command. So now when I run the get module command, you'll see that the Azure PowerShell module has been imported into the current session. Now, to authenticate against your Azure subscription, you'll need to call the Add Azure Account command. Now, if you call the Add Azure Account command with no parameters, you'll be prompted to specify the email account that your Azure subscription is registered to. So if I were to type my Microsoft account name and hit continue, I'll then be prompted for the password for my account. After typing the password to my account, I will get an error because I typed the wrong password. Sorry about that. If I type the correct password, the authentication dialog will close, and you'll see that it actually adds an authentication account to my Azure PowerShell module. Now, you'll see a bunch of interesting information here. First of all is the ID of the email account that the Azure subscription is registered to. And next, you'll actually see the unique identifiers, which are called the subscription IDs, that uniquely represent each Azure subscription that you have access to. So in this particular case, my account, pcgeek86@gmail.com, actually has access to 2 different Azure subscriptions. So I can provision resources in either subscription. Now, an Azure subscription is more or less an administrative boundary that prevents other people from accessing the resources in that subscription unless you explicitly grant access to that individual. So
Trevor?
Yes.
Sorry, so for the part where you did a add Azure account, right?
Yes.
So the password, the credential that you key in is only persistent to this PowerShell session only, right?
That's actually a great question. So the question is does the authentication persist across PowerShell sessions? And the answer is actually yes, it does. So basically what happens when you call Add Azure Account, you receive what's called a token, and the token has an expiration date on it, right? So basically this authentication token that I received after calling Add Azure Account will persist for, I believe, somewhere in the range of 8 hours or so.
I see.
Now, what's important to note is that there's actually 2 different types of accounts. So I used what's called a Microsoft account, and we all generally know what Microsoft accounts are. They're called basically they used to be known as Windows Live IDs. And so when you use a Windows Live ID, From what I've noticed, this is simply anecdotal evidence. I don't have any actual documentation to support it, but the authentication token for a live ID or Microsoft account now is less than the lifetime of an Azure Active Directory account. So one of the things that I was going to discuss is actually setting up an Azure Active Directory account, a user account, that you can authenticate against Azure with. So let me get into that. But does that at least answer part of your question, Milton?
Yes, that'd be good. Thank you.
Okay, great. So once you're logged into the Microsoft Azure portal, which is available at manage.windowsazure.com, you'll see a list of the Azure platform services along the left-hand side. Now, when you sign up for Azure for the first time, you will actually get provisioned what's called an Azure Active Directory tenant. Now, Azure Active Directory is very, very different from on-premises Windows Server Active Directory. So it's important to note that users that you create in Azure Active Directory are not actually Windows Server Active Directory accounts, right? It's a different identity platform, and there are methods to synchronize on-premises Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. But when you're using Azure Active Directory as a standalone identity system, it operates very differently from Active Directory on-premise. So what you'll want to do is come into your Microsoft Azure portal and then scroll down to the Azure Active Directory feature. And you'll choose your directory and then go over to the Users tab. And what you'll want to do is click the Add User button and create a new user account. Now you can call the user account whatever you want, and most likely you'll be provisioned a domain name such as your subscription email address .onmicrosoft.com. And all you want to do is come in here and create a basic user. So we'll just call it Posh. You can just enable it as a standard user. It doesn't need to have any special permissions for Active Directory itself. And then you'll go ahead and create the actual user account. Now you'll be given a temporary password, and what you're going to want to do is go over and open a new in-private browser session so that none of your cookies are saved. And then you'll want to go to what's called the My Apps portal, which is at myapps.microsoft.com, just so you can see the URL there. Now, when you go to myapps.microsoft.com, you'll plug in the user account that you just created. And you'll plug in the temporary password that was provisioned during the user account creation, and you will sign into the account. Now, because that was a temporary password, you will be prompted to change your password to something permanent. Now, once you've changed the user account password to something permanent, you can now begin using that user account to authenticate against Azure. But there's one more thing that we have to do. So we've actually created a new Azure Active Directory user account, but that user account doesn't have access to actually manage our Azure subscription to create different resources, whether they're virtual networks or virtual machines or storage or any other type of Azure resource. So what you're going to want to do is back out to the main feature page here, and then you're going to go all the way to the bottom and go to Settings. Now you're going to click on the Administrators tab, and this basically lists out which user accounts have administrative access to your Azure subscriptions. So as you can see, the posh@pcgeek86gmail.onmicrosoft.com account does not exist in this list. So if we authenticated with that account, we would basically have no subscriptions to manage, right? So if we pull up the PowerShell module here and go to Add Azure Account, and we type our new user account, and then our password, we should authenticate successfully. However, as you'll notice, there's no subscriptions associated with that account because we haven't actually granted that account access to manage our Azure platform subscription. So when you come into the Settings and then Administrators tab here, you'll go ahead and go click Add at the bottom. Now you need to type the user account name here. And after successfully typing the correct user account name, you'll actually see a green check mark there, and you'll see this little badge icon, which indicates that it's a valid Azure Active Directory account. If you type an invalid account name, it will say that it is not a valid user account in your Azure Active Directory. So once you do that, you'll check off which subscriptions that account has access to manage, and it'll go ahead and add those accounts. So now, when we come back to Azure PowerShell and we call Add Azure Account again, we type in our username, type in our password, and you can now see that there are 2 subscriptions associated with that account. So we can now use this user account to authenticate against these subscriptions and start building resources such as virtual networks, virtual machines, storage, SQL databases, and all the other fun stuff that's available in Azure. So if we want to authentication, so basically we are calling Add Azure Account, and the dialog box is popping up to prompt us for our credential. We're typing our credential, and then PowerShell is using that to authenticate against Azure. Now you can also use non-interactive authentication, and non-interactive authentication is great if you are writing automation scripts that run on an automated schedule, such as through Azure Automation or through a scheduled task of some sort, right? Any type of task scheduling system. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is to create a variable that contains our user account name. So this is for non-interactive authentication. So next we want to create what's called a PS credential. So we'll actually type our password. I'm just going to use a fake password for now. To define the username and password, you're going to create what's called a PS credential object. Now, there's 2 arguments that you need to pass into the constructor for the PS credential. One is the username, and the second is the password. Now, the password actually has to be what's called a secure string in PowerShell, not simply a regular string. So we need to actually call the convert to secure string command and specify that we want to use plain text, and we want to force it because we're basically overriding it by embedding our password as a plain text string. And so the second argument is going to be the secure string, which is our password for the Azure platform. Now, once we've created the credential object, so we'll assign that to a variable called Azure Credential, we'll call the Add Azure Account command. But the different thing that we're going to do this time is we're going to specify the credential parameter. So as you can see, there is a credential parameter on the Add Azure Account command, and then we'll simply pass in the Azure credential that we created using the new object command here. So just for security reasons, let me go ahead and just reset that password to something different. I'm going to go in here to my apps portal and reset the password. So I'm going to go over my profile and then click Change Password. And this is basically just a user self-service portal that allows you to change your own password in Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to go ahead and set it to that temporary password that I created. And type in my here. My email. So as you can see, I've got a verification email here, and I need to type in a verification code for my account and verify. Okay, so now I should have a new password. So basically, if I run this code here, by hitting F8 in the PowerShell ISE. You can see that I've now successfully authenticated silently, so no authentication dialog was actually popped up. So using this technique here, we can actually interact with the Azure PowerShell module and authenticate to the Azure PowerShell module using no interaction. So basically, we're not going to get prompted for our username or password because we've specified that as part of the script. So I know there's a lot of information there. Are there any questions on Azure authentication at this point?
All good.
Okay, great. Looks like there's no questions in the chat window either. So as I mentioned, Microsoft is kind of getting away from using the management certificate authentication. So make sure that if you sign up for Azure, make sure that you create an Azure Active Directory account, kind of per the directions that we just looked at, and use either interactive or the non-interactive authentication. So now that you've authenticated to Azure, we've gone through a lot of discussion around that topic. So now that you've authenticated to Azure, what can you actually do with Azure? Well, the first step is to basically use the built-in PowerShell commands to discover what's available in the Azure PowerShell module. Next, you'll want to kind of read the help for those different commands, and then you'll want to execute them and basically review the results. So what occurred? So if we switch back over to the PowerShell session here, we can run the get command, which is one of the built-in PowerShell discovery commands, and then we can specify the name of the module that we want to get a list of commands from. In this case, we want to get a list of commands that are available in the Azure PowerShell module. Now, if you take a look here, there's actually quite a few different commands. So if we actually grab the count property on that, you'll see that there's 509 different commands inside the Azure PowerShell module. So there's a lot of different things going on here. There's a lot of different features in the Microsoft Azure platform that we can automate. And so it can be a little bit intimidating at times, but I would encourage you to just be patient, read some blog posts, take some training from my company, Optagility, if you need to, and really just kind of get familiar with the different commands that match up to the feature that you want to automate. So there's a lot of commands in here to automate different features, and some of those features you may simply not care about. For example, you may not use Azure SQL database at all, and you might simply want to automate virtual networks and virtual machines, and that's okay. So we'll use those built-in PowerShell discovery commands to kind of figure out what to do. So let's dive into some of the different Azure platform features. So one of the core features of the Azure platform is the ability to create SQL Server databases without having to manage the underlying virtual machines. So we can use the get command in PowerShell to filter for commands that contain the name SQL. So if we run get command for the Azure PowerShell module, and then specify that we want only commands with SQL somewhere inside the name, we can actually dynamically list out the commands that deal with SQL Server in Azure. So this is a much more concise list than the 509 commands that we explored earlier, and this allows us to see some of the different operations that we can perform against the Azure SQL feature. So some of the different things that we can do are create a new SQL database server. We can create SQL Server databases on top of the server. We can create firewall rules that secure access to our SQL Server. And we can even do things like create copies or export and import or perform recovery and restores against our Azure SQL databases. So there's a lot of really powerful features that are available that help us to automate the Azure SQL feature. So the high-level architecture of the SQL feature is as follows. The first step is to create a SQL server. Now, when you create a SQL server, even though you're creating a virtual machine instance, you're not actually responsible for managing the security of that virtual machine itself. Now, you can create firewall rules that secure access to the SQL instances, but you're not actually required to patch and maintain the operating system of the underlying SQL server. Once you create a SQL server in Azure SQL, you can begin to create SQL Server databases on top of it. Additionally, you can create firewall rules that restrict access to those SQL Server instances. So next is the Microsoft Azure Storage feature. Now, the top level entity in the Azure Storage feature is what's called a storage account. So if you want to store any type of data in Azure, generally the first step you're going to do is to create a storage account. Now, again, we can use the PowerShell get command to list all of the storage-related features or storage-related commands in the Azure PowerShell module. So let's go ahead and do that now. So if we run get command -module Azure -name *store*, you can see a list of storage-related commands in Azure PowerShell. So you can instantiate a lot of different Azure resources using the new commands, and one of those commands allows us to create a new Azure Storage account. Once you create an Azure Storage account, there's several different types of storage that are available in Azure. The first one is a preview feature called Azure Files, and Azure Files basically allows you to create a platform as a service SMB share, or server message block share, very similar to a Windows Server file share, directly inside of your storage account. Now, later on, once you actually build a virtual machine, you can begin to mount these SMB shares to your virtual machines, which allows you to share files between them. You can also upload and download files directly from the SMB share in the cloud using the Azure PowerShell module. The next feature is called Azure Blob Storage. And Azure Blob Storage is the core feature that's been around since the inception of Azure that allows you to host VHDs or virtual hard disks that actually back your virtual machines. So anytime that you're building virtual machines inside of Azure or storing any arbitrary file data in Azure Storage accounts, you're going to want to be familiar with Azure Blob Storage, because that's the actual backing mechanism that supports the virtual machine feature. Now, the table and queuing services are developer platform as a service features that we're not really going to dive into too much. However, it is important to point out that if you're in a DevOps role, you can actually support your developers by automatically instantiating and managing table and queue storage. So Azure Virtual Networks are one of the key features that make up the infrastructure as a service role of the Microsoft Azure Public Cloud. Virtual networks are standalone entities that you can create without any other dependencies. Virtual networks have a top-level IPv4 address space, for example, 10.0.0.0/8, that you can then carve up into smaller subnets that actually make up the different portions of your network. For example, you might have a subnet that's dedicated to servers with static IP addresses, and maybe you have another subnet that contains virtual machines that are used by developers for software testing. Additionally, you can create what's called a gateway subnet, which is very similar to a standard subnet, except that a gateway subnet allows you to establish a VPN gateway, which you can then connect to from either a site-to-site or point-to-site, so a laptop to cloud scenario, where you can actually connect directly to that virtual network from either a laptop or your on-premises network and begin to manage the different virtual machines as if they were on your own network. One of the other key features of virtual networks is DNS servers. So when you create a DNS server, you're not actually creating a DNS service itself. What you're creating is basically a pointer to an internal IP address within your Azure Virtual Network where virtual machines can point to as their DNS servers. So for example, you might create a subnet that contains your domain controllers with DNS services, and you can then configure a DNS server pointer that points to your different DNS or your different domain controllers / DNS servers that reside in that particular subnet. That way, anytime you build a virtual machine inside of a virtual network subnet in Azure, the DNS server pointers that you create will be assigned to that VM using a DHCP-like process. Additionally, you can use the Azure PowerShell module to create and destroy virtual network gateways. Now, the virtual network gateways are the actual objects that allow you to connect to a VPN using your laptop or a site-to-site connection from your on-premises network. There's a couple of different virtual network gateway SKUs available. So when you create a virtual network, you can either choose the default performance level, which provides up to 100 megabit per second throughput, or you can choose from a new high performance SKU in the Azure platform that provides up to 200 megabits per second. Now, the cost is different for these two gateway SKUs, so make sure that you review the Azure pricing page before you actually provision these gateways. Some different operations that you can do with gateways include creating the gateway, and you would need to specify the name of the virtual network where you're going to provision that gateway for. You would choose the performance level, either standard or high performance, and then you would choose the type of routing, and you can choose from either static or dynamic routing. You can also use the Azure PowerShell module to remove the Azure VPN gateway, and that will allow you to save costs because you're actually paying for any time that the VPN gateway is provisioned. Another new feature, a relatively new feature of the Azure Virtual Network feature is called network security groups. Now, network security groups are basically router-level firewall rules that allow you to control the flow of network traffic within a virtual network subnet. So a network security group is created inside of a particular Azure region, very similar to all other Azure resources. And each network security group is made up of multiple rules. Now, when you create a new network security group, there's a default set of rules. However, you can add your own rules that override the default rules. Once you've created your network security group and all of the firewall rules that you want to associate with it, you can then either associate the network security group with a virtual network subnet, or you can also assign a network security group to an individual virtual machine if there's a particular VM that you want to apply a set of firewall rules to. Now, you can use the Azure PowerShell module to automate this entire process, from creating the network security group to adding the network security group rules, and finally creating the association between the network security group and either the virtual network subnet or the individual virtual machine. So finally, we talk about Azure virtual machines. So we've already talked about virtual networks. Now, we can provision Azure virtual machines either inside of a virtual network or outside of a virtual network. Now, the architecture for Azure virtual machines looks like the following. The top-level entity in Azure that you use to create virtual machines is called the cloud service. Now, the cloud service is basically a container that can hold up to 50 Azure virtual machines. The cloud service is exposed to the public internet using a globally unique DNS name, such as opsagility.cloudapp.net. And the cloud service also contains a publicly routable IP address, IPv4 address specifically, that allows you to access the virtual machines and other application services within the cloud service. Once you create the cloud service container, you can begin creating virtual machines inside of it. Now, you can create virtual machines with different sizes. For example, if you have a domain controller that doesn't get a lot of traffic, you can create what's called a small virtual machine, which, for example, has a single CPU core and about 1.5 gigs of memory. There's many other different VM sizes, and you can use the command down here at the bottom called get Azure role size to get a comprehensive list of all the supported role sizes in the Azure platform. Now, when you deploy a virtual machine, you can deploy virtual machines either from on-premises VHDs that you've uploaded to the Azure Blob Storage service, or you can use the Azure Image Gallery, which allows you to deploy new virtual machines using pre-configured images that are provided in the gallery. Now, if you want to query for a list of available images to deploy your virtual machines from, there's a PowerShell command called get Azure VM image that allows you to list out the different images available in the gallery. Now, there's some other commands available that allow you to build virtual machines, and the first one that you would use to get started is called the new Azure VM config command. The new Azure VM config command creates a virtual machine configuration that tells the Azure platform what size of virtual machine to create, what the name of the virtual machine is, and some other details. Next, you'll call the Add Azure Provisioning Config command, which allows you to configure the administrative username and password that you'll use to log into that virtual machine once it's been created. Finally, you'll use the new Azure VM command to actually instantiate the virtual machine based off of the configuration that you used with the other commands we just talked about. There's also a variety of virtual machine extensions that are available in the Azure platform. And what these basically allow you to do is configure the Azure virtual machine using the Azure VM guest agent. So basically, the first extension that we want to talk about is called the VM access extension. So if you ever lose access to one of your virtual machines because you forget the username and password to log into that virtual machine, as long as you have administrative access to your Azure subscription, you can configure what's called the VM access extension, and you can actually reset the admin username and password on your VM so that you can then gain access to it. So basically the way that this works is you call the get Azure VM command on an existing VM. You call the set Azure VM access extension command to configure the extension. And then you call the update Azure VM command to actually apply that configuration to the cloud-based virtual machine. Once you've completed those commands, you can then RDP into the virtual machine using the new username and password. There's also a desired state configuration extension for Azure virtual machines. And what this allows you to do is upload a package, a DSC package, up to the Azure Blob Storage service. And then you can call the set Azure VM DSC extension command to actually apply the DSC configuration to a new virtual machine. Once that virtual machine receives the DSC configuration, it'll actually download the config from Blob Storage and apply it to that local virtual machine. This really simplifies the configuration of your Azure VMs. There's also what's called a PowerShell custom script extension, and what this allows you to do is deploy arbitrary PowerShell code out to your virtual machines to perform any configuration tasks that you need. So the custom script extension works very similar to the DSC extension, where you actually upload a PowerShell script to Azure Blob Storage, and then you publish a configuration for the extension to the Azure virtual machine, and the virtual machine downloads the PowerShell script from Azure Blob Storage and applies it to the local system. One of the other key features of the Azure platform that I'd like to talk about is called Azure Automation. So Azure Automation is basically the equivalent of the on-premises solution called Service Management Automation, or SMA. SMA allows you to create what's called automation runbooks that automate different workflows in your IT environment. To get started with the Azure Automation feature, you create what's called an automation account. Inside the automation account, you import your automation runbooks, which are essentially just PowerShell workflows. Next, you can create assets, and assets are basically variables that help you to drive your automation runbooks dynamically. When you deploy a runbook, it reads assets from the automation account and deploys the runbook to what's called a runbook worker. The runbook worker returns a runbook job object back to your automation account that allows you to track the progress of the runbook. So let's take a look at some different automation commands in the Azure PowerShell module to finalize this presentation. So let me hop on over to this folder here. So we've already talked a little bit about how do we authenticate to the Azure PowerShell module. So the first thing that we need to do is get a PowerShell credential and then call the Add Azure Account command. So we've already talked about the authentication in quite a bit of depth. Now, the one part that we didn't talk about was actually managing your Azure subscriptions. So as you saw earlier, when we authenticated with the new user account that we created, we have a list of subscriptions that we have access to. But how do we know which subscription we're actually operating on? Well, there's a variety of subscription-related commands in the Azure PowerShell module that allow us to manage just that. So if we call get command module Azure, and then specify that the name should contain subscription, you'll see a list of subscription-related commands. Now, for this particular presentation, we don't really care about the Azure Pack subscription commands because we're dealing with the Azure Public Cloud. So what we really care about are basically get Azure subscription that allows us to list out our subscriptions, a select Azure subscription command that allows us to select the subscription we want to use, and set Azure subscription, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So if we just call the get Azure subscription command, we can get all of the details for our Microsoft Azure subscriptions. Once we find a list of our Azure subscriptions that are available, we can then use the select Azure subscription command to actually select which one we want to operate on. So think of this as basically a context switch where we're telling the Azure PowerShell module that we want to begin working on the Visual Studio Ultimate with MSDN subscription. So when we call that command, we are now in the context of that subscription. So any Azure PowerShell commands that we call are going to operate on that subscription rather than any others that we have access to. Finally, to ensure that we're actually operating on the correct subscription, we can call get Azure subscription-current to make sure that the currently selected subscription is actually the correct one. So now that we've authenticated to Azure and selected the appropriate subscription, the next step is to talk about Azure SQL Server. So we already touched on Azure SQL a little bit before, and we used the get command to look at some of the different SQL functions that are available. So we can use the get Azure SQL Database Server command to list out all of the Azure SQL servers that we have provisioned in our environment. As you can see, in my particular subscription, I actually have 3 different Azure SQL servers provisioned. If you forget the administrative password to one of your SQL servers, you can use the set Azure SQL Database Server command to reset the password to something different. If you want to manage SQL Server databases or firewall rules on a particular server, you can create what's called a SQL Server context by using the new Azure SQL Database Server context command. Now, you'll specify a credential that you created when you created the Azure SQL Server, and basically that credential will then be used to manage the virtual machine. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to specify one of the specific server names here. So let's say we want to manage that one. Okay, so as you can see, I've actually been denied access to manage this particular SQL server because the IP address that I'm accessing it from does not have access to that particular server. So what we can do is we can use the new Azure SQL Database Firewall Rule command to enable access to a particular subnet. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and specify that all IP addresses from 50.193 have access to this particular SQL server. Again, I have to specify the SQL server name here. So now that I've created that new SQL Server database rule, if I go back and create that SQL context object again, I will get an error. I don't know why that's occurring. Let me just try to reset the password here. I'm going to reset the password on that SQL server and then try one more time to create that SQL context. Okay, for whatever reason that isn't working right now, but that at least shows how we can create a firewall rule. Once we create that SQL Server context, we can then call the database commands that actually manage databases on that SQL server. So for example, we can call the get Azure SQL Database command that allows us to list out all the SQL databases that we've created. And then we can use the set Azure SQL Database command to actually change the edition of SQL Server that we use in the cloud. Now, if you dig into the pricing details on Azure SQL Server, you'll notice that there's a variety of different editions of SQL. So you can subscribe to the basic, business, premium, standard, and web tiers. The business and web tiers are actually being retired, so basic, premium, and standard are going to be the normal database tiers that you're going to be interested in. Now, each of these database tiers changes the throughput or database throughput units or DTUs that are available to each database. So go ahead and go out to the Azure pricing page to get more details about that. But the point here that you should take away from this presentation is that you can use PowerShell to dynamically scale the speed of your Azure SQL instances. The Microsoft Azure Storage service allows us to upload arbitrary data to Azure Storage. Additionally, the Azure Storage service is what backs Azure Virtual Machines. So in this example, we're going to create what's called an Azure Storage account, which, as you may recall from our presentation, is the top-level node that allows us to create different types of storage resources. So in this particular case, we're going to create the new storage account named PowerSBreakfast. And we're going to tell Azure what location or what region in the world we want to create it in. So in this particular case, I'm creating a storage account in the North Central US region. There's also a type parameter on the new Azure Storage Account command that allows you to specify the type of storage redundancy that you would like for your storage account. So in this particular case, I'm using what's called local redundant storage. And if you read up on locally redundant storage in the Azure platform, you'll actually see that LRS is the most basic level of storage that provides 3 copies of your data in a particular region. So inside of the North Central US region, I will have at least 3 copies of my data that I upload into that storage account at all times. So this provides for high availability in the case of an Azure data center outage. So once we create the storage account, we create what's called a storage context, very similar to the SQL context. And this allows us to actually manage resources inside of that storage account. So for example, we can create what's called a storage container. And a container basically is like a folder. So once we create a storage container or folder, we can then begin uploading data to it. So I've successfully created the container inside the blob storage account. And let's just switch over to the portal just so you guys can get a graphical view of what that looks like. So if I go over to my storage accounts, I should see PowerSBreakfast listed in here. Let me just hit F5 to refresh the view. And once I see that storage account created, here it is, I can then go over to the Containers tab, and I can see that I've created a PowerSBreakfast container inside that storage account. Now, if you click on that container or folder, you'll see that there's no blobs actually stored inside of that container. So let's go ahead and upload a blob to that container using the Azure PowerShell module. So in this particular case, I'm going to specify the storage account context that I created earlier. And the context is basically just an authentication context that allows me to manage resources inside of that storage account. Next, I'm going to specify the storage container name that I just created. Next, I'm going to specify a file parameter that specifies the file on the local file system that I want to upload. And then finally, I can use the force parameter to overwrite the file if it already exists in the storage container. So let's go ahead and run this command. And that's actually going to upload a local file up to Azure Blob Storage. So if I go ahead and just refresh this page here, you'll see that the DLL file that I had stored locally will actually get uploaded to that storage container. Now, storage containers are single-level entities, so you can't create nested storage containers like you can folders on an NTFS file system, so just be aware of that. I can also use PowerShell to actually list out the storage blobs. So I just used the Azure Management Portal to verify that that DLL file was uploaded successfully, but I can also use the get Azure Storage blob command to verify that that file is in Azure Blob Storage as well. Next, we can also make copies of Azure blobs directly in the cloud. So rather than downloading a blob locally to our computer and then uploading that blob to a different name, I can simply instruct the Azure platform to create a copy of that blob instantaneously. So I'm going to use the start Azure Storage blob copy. I'm going to tell it what the source container and the destination container, the source blob and the destination blob are. So basically, I'm going to copy termserve.dll over to termserve2.dll without actually downloading the file locally. So if I hit F8 there, that command is going to return instantaneously. And if I go back up to get Azure Storage blob, I can now see that I have two files there, and I didn't actually have to download it locally first in order to make a copy. Finally, I can use the remove Azure Storage blob command to delete files out of Azure Blob Storage. So if I delete termserve.dll, I should only have termserve2.dll. And then if I delete termserve2.dll, I should now have nothing inside of that container. Just refresh the container in the management portal. We should see that disappear. And there you go. So that's Azure Storage for you, at least at a high level. So let's finish this up. I know we're going kind of long here, longer than I anticipated. So let's finish by talking a little bit about Azure Automation. So Azure Automation is the service management automation equivalent in the Azure public cloud. And what we can do with the Azure PowerShell module is actually manage our automation runbooks or our PowerShell workflows that are inside of our Azure Automation feature. So what I can do is go step out here to the Azure Automation feature in the portal, and you can see that I have different automation accounts created. I can use the Azure PowerShell module to actually list out the different automation accounts that I have using get Azure Automation account. And then I can start using commands like get Azure Automation runbook to actually list out the different runbooks that I have in that particular automation account. So in this case, I have an account name called Azure Automation, and then I use the get Azure Automation runbook command to retrieve the runbooks from that particular account. Finally, I just output the name property, and you can see I have all of these different automation runbooks created inside that automation account. If I want to create a new empty automation runbook, I can use the new Azure Automation runbook command. I'm actually going to delete the runbook if it already exists, and then simply recreate it. And then I can use the set Azure Automation runbook definition command to actually upload a local PS1 file that contains the workflow definition up to the PowerShell workflow. Now, if I actually go inside here and actually look at one of my automation runbooks, let me just have that load up here. And I go over to the Author tab on my automation runbook, you'll see that there's two different slots here. I've got the published version and the draft version. So the draft version allows you to edit it, and the published version is basically the production-ready version that's already been tested and you know that it works. So I can actually use the publish Azure Automation runbook command to take a draft of my runbook and then publish it to the production slot once I know that it's been tested accurately. Finally, if I want to actually kick off an automation runbook up in the cloud, I can use the Azure PowerShell command called start Azure Automation runbook to kick off that PowerShell workflow and pass in some parameters to it. Once I've kicked off the automation runbook job, I can actually retrieve the job, and then after it's finished, I can monitor its status, make sure that it's finished, and then I can actually use the get Azure Automation job output command to retrieve the actual output that was emitted by that particular automation runbook. So that's all I've got for today. I know we went a little bit long, so I apologize for talking so much. But I hope that this gives you guys a good overview of some of the capabilities of the Microsoft Azure platform. And I really hope that you'll begin to adopt it and investigate different ways to use it in your company. So Milton, I will turn things back over to you.
Really, thank you very much for your session. I mean, on the ground, do you have any question for Trevor on Azure? Any question? Because to me, he's an Azure expert. He just ran through the topic on block storage, which I use it for PoSHBreakfast. Okay, so what we did was, we just migrated the PoSHBreakfast website to Azure, and we host all the video on block storage, Azure Storage. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Okay. So, is there any question from the ground before we let Trevor go continue for his long break?
Is this useful to you guys? Any feedback you'd like to provide?
To me, definitely it's very useful because
Yeah, if you're managing if you're managing your recordings on Azure Blob Storage, this is definitely a great way.
yeah,
You can even expose your Azure Storage containers to the public.
yeah,
So if you want to allow the public to simply download your videos, you can create a container that has public access enabled, and then people can actually download your videos anonymously from Azure Blob Storage.
yeah. So that's the question. Okay.
Yeah, so Aruna, thanks for the question. So what's the difference between the Azure VM and Azure Quick VM commands? So those are actually new commands, so new Azure VM and new Azure Quick VM. So basically the new Azure Quick VM is a command is simply a slightly simpler way to get started with creating virtual machines. It doesn't require quite as much configuration as the new Azure VM command does. If you want more details on that, we've actually got some training content that we've developed around provisioning Azure resources. So feel free to reach out to me at trevor@opsagility.com. Trevor@opsagility.com. Let me just type that here because I can't talk. So there's a lot more flexibility when you use the new Azure VM command because you can configure things like virtual machine extensions. You can configure VM endpoints. There's a lot of different things that you can actually configure on the VM object that the new Azure Quick VM command doesn't really give you access to. Even if you do provision an Azure VM using new Azure Quick VM, you can still always reconfigure the VM using the get Azure VM command. And then downloading the configuration locally using get Azure VM, and then you can basically call update Azure VM to apply a manipulated configuration. However, the key point here is that there's certain features in Azure that can only be configured when you create a virtual machine. So one of those particular features that we didn't talk about was actually provisioning what's called a reserved IP address, or it has it's an instance level public IP address. So basically, rather than exposing your virtual machines through an Azure cloud container, that model still applies. So your VMs are always exposed through the cloud service container. However, you can actually assign a publicly routable IPv4 address directly to an individual virtual machine rather than having to create what are called NAT rules or endpoint rules to forward traffic from external ports to internal ports on the VMs. So there's some scenarios where you have to use the new Azure VM command. Sorry for the long-winded response.
That's fine. Okay, any question from Paul? So Paul should start looking at using Azure, okay? Okay, so I think if there's no question, then that's about it for today's session.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, Milton. I really appreciate the opportunity.
I really appreciate you. Enjoy your long weekend.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye.